Let's start with a challenge. Can you tell which of these headlines, all of which actually appeared on social media, are true and which are false? Kim Jong-un killed in Trump's overnight black op attack on North Korea. US stocks tumble after Trump announces new import tariffs. FBI uncovers evidence that 62 million Trump voters are all Russian agents. Melania Trump unveils Be Best campaign for children. Okay, that was pretty easy, right? Try these ones. Trump's personal lawyer costing taxpayers $10,000 per hour. Doctor claims that Trump dictated the letter attesting to his extraordinary health. GOP congressman claims that Charlottesville's deadly white nationalist rally was a left-wing setup. And Trump protester speaks out. I was paid $3,500 to protest Trump's rally. Turns out, these two are entirely false, fabricated stories, while these two are actually true. This gives you a taste of the confusion that we all sometimes experience on social media. Scrolling through your headlines, it's often hard to know what to believe. In this talk, I'm going to help you navigate situations like this. I'm going to teach you how to protect yourself against misleading headlines. And I'm also going to show you how you can help your friends do the same, spreading truth and fighting falsehood in your social networks. Because look, we all care about the truth. This isn't about us versus them or about red versus blue. This talk is about how we can each help safeguard our democracy by improving the accuracy of how we read and what we share online. In order to do so, we have to start with a fundamental question about human psychology. How do we decide what to believe? The standard answer is our biases. We believe what we want to believe. Instead of using our reasoning abilities to uncover the truth, we just convince ourselves that we were right all along, believing false stories that align with our ideology and discrediting true stories that don't. This paints a pretty gloomy picture of human nature, that we're slaves to our ideological biases, and that getting both sides to agree on the facts, let alone what to do about them, is hopeless. So democracy is doomed, and we need to submit to ever more intensive oversight from our algorithmic overlords in order to save us from ourselves. But this account, what psychologists call motivated reasoning, is not the only possible explanation as to why people believe false, misleading headlines or fake news. And in this talk, I'm going to argue it's not actually the right explanation. Instead, research that I've conducted with my co-author Gord Pennycook suggests that the real problem isn't motivated reasoning or willful ignorance. It's mainly just mental laziness, our failure to think critically about what we're reading. Over the last 2 years, Gord and I have conducted over 40 studies surveying more than 25,000 Americans to understand what determines what people believe and what they share. For example, in one study, we asked over 1,000 participants to rate the accuracy of a series of true and false headlines, all of which actually appeared on social media. We presented the headlines just as they would have looked on Facebook, like this. And then we asked, do you think this headline describes an event that actually happened in an accurate and unbiased way? We only showed the headlines rather than the full stories because research suggests that on social media, most of the time, people only read the headlines anyways. Based on their responses, we can therefore quantify how good each particular participant is at differentiating truth from falsehood. Then, to test whether reasoning just confirms our ideological biases or actually helps us uncover the truth, we wanted to see whether participants who engaged in more reasoning were better or worse at telling true from false. If reasoning just reinforces our biases and we're slaves to our ideology, then we would expect that people engaged in more reasoning would actually be worse at telling true from false. That's because better reasoners would be better able to convince themselves to believe false headlines that align with their ideology and better able to talk themselves out of believing true headlines that don't. They would be able to string together chains of maybe a little bit questionable logic in order to get them to the answer that they want rather than to the truth. If, on the other hand, reasoning actually does help people uncover the truth, then straightforwardly, you would expect that people that engage in more reasoning would be better at differentiating true from false. In order to test these competing predictions, we had our participants complete the cognitive reflection test, a widely used measure from behavioral economics and psychology that allows you to quantify the extent to which participants engage in reasoning. In the cognitive reflection test, participants answer a series of questions that have intuitively compelling but actually incorrect answers. These trick questions give us a window into the extent to which participants just go with their gut versus stopping to think more carefully. For example, consider this question. Emily's father has 3 daughters. The first 2 daughters are named April and May. What is the third daughter's name? For most of our participants, June comes immediately to mind. They might just write it down and keep going, or they might stop and think for a second and realize, oh, actually, the answer must be Emily. Or try this example, and warning, this one involves a little bit of math. How many cubic feet of dirt are there in a hole that's 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide by 3 feet long? Now, you might think, okay, cubic feet, so I got to get volume, I multiply 3 times 3 times 3. Okay, 27, great, and write it down. Or you might think for 1 second more and realize it's a hole, so there's no dirt in it. The idea then is that participants that engage in less reasoning, who are more likely to write down June or 27, will get a lower score on the test, whereas participants that engage in more reasoning will catch those incorrect answers, fix them, and therefore do better on the test. And an important thing to note is that by and large, these questions don't really require a huge amount of intelligence or education to get right. It's more a question of just, did you bother to stop and think about it? And so in this way, the cognitive reflection test gives us a measure of the extent to which people engage in reasoning. The key question for us then is when we measured participants' scores on the cognitive reflection test, which I'll show on the x-axis, we asked, how does it relate to their fraction of false versus true headlines that they rated as accurate, which I'll show on the y-axis, with false stories in orange and true stories in blue. Now remember, if reasoning just reinforces our biases, then we would expect people that do better on the cognitive reflection test, and therefore engage in more reasoning, to be worse at differentiating true from false, because they're better able to convince themselves of what they want to believe rather than the truth. But that's totally not what we found. Regardless of whether they were Democrats or Republicans, and whether the headlines aligned with their ideology or not, we found that participants that did better on the cognitive reflection test were better at telling true from false. They were less likely to believe false headlines, and they were more likely to believe true headlines. This was even the case when headlines aligned with participants' ideology, so they had a motivation to believe them. And this therefore suggests that reasoning really does help us inoculate us against misinformation, rather than just reinforcing our biases. This is an extremely robust result. We've replicated it in many subsequent studies, using several different subject pools and over 100 different headlines. We've also shown that this pattern can't be explained just by differences in age, gender, education, political ideology, or mathematical ability. Even when you take all of those factors into account, we still find that participants that did better on the cognitive reflection test are better at differentiating true from false. We also have direct evidence of a link between reasoning and uncovering of the truth from another experiment with over 1,100 participants, where we found that instructing participants to rely on reason while they were reading the headlines made them significantly better at telling true from false compared to telling them to rely on emotion. These results, therefore, suggest that when it comes to falling for false, deceptive headlines, the problem is more about lack of reasoning than it is about motivated reasoning or willful ignorance. But what about the decision of what to share on social media? When we started this research agenda, we had naively assumed that people typically share content online that they believe to be true. But to our surprise, in 2 studies with over 750 participants, we actually found that how accurate a headline was had very little to do with how likely people were to say they would share it on social media. Even though participants rated true stories as much more accurate than false stories, when we looked at the fraction of headlines they said they would share on social media, which I'll show here on the y-axis, we found that participants were only slightly more likely to say they would share true stories compared to false stories. This was in contrast to, for example, partisanship, where we found that participants were much more likely to say that they would share content that aligned with their politics compared to content that didn't, regardless of whether the stories were true or false. So this suggests that accuracy is not actually a primary driver of social media sharing, which is probably more the result of things like signaling your identity or group membership. Nonetheless, when we had participants complete the cognitive reflection test and then looked at how their performance on the test, which I'll show on the x-axis, related to the fraction of false headlines they said they would share, which I'll show on the y-axis, we found a pattern that was similar to what we found for accuracy. Participants who did better on the cognitive reflection test, and therefore were engaged in more reasoning, were significantly less likely to say that they would share false headlines. Not only that, but in another study, we looked at the actual Twitter profiles of another 2,000 participants, and we found that, sure enough, participants who did better on the cognitive reflection test, who engaged in more reasoning, actually shared substantially less political misinformation through their actual Twitter profiles. These results about perceived accuracy and social media sharing suggest that we don't have to be held captive to our political biases if we bother to stop and think about the content that we're reading. The problem, though, is that social media platforms, almost by design, are places where it seems particularly difficult to stop and think critically. For example, we tend to scroll through our feeds very quickly, spending 2 or 3 seconds per post, if that. So we don't have the time that's required to engage more deeply with the content that we're reading. Furthermore, we often log into our social media accounts specifically because we're looking to relax and zone out, not engage in lots of cognitive, effortful thinking. And finally, on social media, news is mixed in with pictures of friends' weddings, videos of kids' birthday parties, and cats wearing hats on bicycles with flamethrowers. All of which predisposes us to not think critically about the content that we're reading. So it's natural that even if we're very thoughtful people in general, when we're on social media, we're much less likely to be thinking carefully about what we're reading compared to, say, making an important business decision at work. And what this means is that we are all surprisingly susceptible to deception and manipulation online. But it doesn't have to be this way. We have control over how we engage with social media, over how quickly we scroll, and over how deeply we read and we think. So let's try and slow things down. Before we share content, let's stop and ask ourselves how accurate it really is. Say, is this too good to be true? Is this coming from a reputable news outlet that has actual editorial standards? And not to get too crazy here, but what if we actually read the articles before we share them with our friends? And speaking of friends, there's something that we can do to help make our friends more discerning in their sharing too. Directly confronting them and yelling at them for making bad posts has the potential to not work out so well. It can cause people to really get defensive and dig in, can lead to escalation, the sharing of more content, and ultimately probably some defriending. But our research suggests that getting your friends to think about the accuracy of other content, for example, headlines you've posted yourself, can make the concept of accuracy top of mind for them. And as a result, when they're making subsequent sharing decisions, they'll be more likely to think about accuracy and they'll be less likely to share misinformation. For example, when you post a thought-provoking article, you could say, "This is fascinating, but I'm not sure how accurate it actually is. What do you all think?" Or, when posting content from reputable outlets, you can talk about how much you appreciate the outlet's investment in the accuracy of their reporting. Evidence for the promise of this approach comes from, among other things, 2 studies we conducted with over 15,000 participants. In the baseline condition, we just had participants rate the accuracy of a series of true and false headlines. When we looked at the fraction of headlines participants said they would share, as I told you before, participants were only slightly more likely to say they would share true headlines compared to false headlines. In the intervention condition, we had participants begin the study by rating the accuracy of a single non-political headline, ostensibly as part of helping us prepare stimuli for a different experiment. Then they went on to complete exactly the same task as the people in the baseline, indicating how likely they would be to share a series of headlines. This time, though, the participants in the intervention, because they had rated the accuracy of that one headline at the beginning, were more likely to be thinking about accuracy while they were making their sharing decisions. And as a result, they were significantly less likely to say they would share false headlines, while remaining equally likely to say they would share true headlines. You'll see that the intervention more than doubled how discerning participants were in their sharing. In addition to this laboratory evidence, we're also in the process of rolling out a large-scale field experiment on Twitter based on these ideas, reducing the spread of actual political misinformation in the wild. A key aspect of this approach is that it doesn't rely on a centralized authority monitoring our every post, certifying truth, and censoring falsehood. Instead, it takes advantage of our own ability to tell true from false if we bother to stop and think about it. This approach also doesn't rely on professional fact-checkers accomplishing the impossible task of keeping up with the endless stream of false news and misinformation constantly being posted online. That is to say, this approach is scalable. Now, there's a lot that social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter can and must do to get their users to think more about accuracy while they're online. But this intervention isn't only in the hands of the social media platforms. It's also something that we can do ourselves. For example, I don't know if you noticed, but in giving this talk, I've actually performed the intervention on you. So afterwards, when you check your news feeds, you'll be more likely to stop and think before you share, saving your friends from misinformation and yourself from looking like an ass. And every time that you ask your friends how accurate a headline is, every time that you praise reputable outlets for investing in accuracy, and every time that you share content, like this talk, about accuracy, fact-checking, or the problems of misinformation, you're delivering your own pro-truth intervention. By doing this, we can help protect each other from manipulators, we can push back against the dangers posed by misinformation, and, just maybe, we can help save our democracy.